Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm speaking with Dr. Tricia Redeker-Hepner, who is a political and legal anthropologist with a regional focus on Northeastern Africa and the Great Lakes region in Eastern Africa, and has thematic interest in migration and displacement, transnationalism, human rights, transnational justice, and conflict and peace resolution. She's the Associate Professor of Anthropology at the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University and the Director of the Graduate Program in Social Justice and Human Rights. She has conducted research in the Horn of Africa with refugees and asylum seekers from Eritrea in North America, Europe, and Africa for over 20 years. She's published 4 university press books and more than 20 peer-reviewed journal articles and chapters. Just some of her published works include Immigrant Eritrean Human Rights Movements, Politics, Law, and Culture in Transnational Perspectives, Religion, Repression, and Human Rights in Eritrea and the Diaspora, and Generational Asylum and Generational Nationalism, Eritrean Migrants, the Global Diaspora, and the Transnational Nation State. I'm pleased to have Dr. Tricia Redeker-Hepner on the channel. Welcome.
Thank you, George. It's really, really nice to be here with you.
Well, just to introduce who you are to the audience, you first visited Eritrea as an undergraduate student in 1995. What was your experience and how did you come to find out about the country?
Yeah, it's so long ago now, but I was a student at Columbia University in New York City. I was studying anthropology, and I was particularly, my imagination was particularly captured by African studies. So I had the good fortune to take a number of different African civilization courses, Africanist anthropology courses, African history courses at Columbia. And I was particularly interested in the Horn of Africa. There was a kind of complexity and a richness to the history there that really, I mean, it kept me very, very interested from the beginning. So I initially really, and it was partly the influence of a professor that I was working with there, a historian by the name of Marcia Wright, who had focused on Ethiopia. And I was particularly interested in Ethiopia. And I was really interested in maybe doing like a study abroad program there. So I actually tried to work out something on my own, a study abroad program. I don't know if I was just naive about how these things work. I don't remember exactly how it went, but I was in touch with some faculty at Addis Ababa University trying to work out an opportunity to study in Ethiopia for a semester or something like that. And I couldn't really work anything out. And then I subsequently found out about an organization called Operation Crossroads Africa, which is, it's a little bit like the Peace Corps, but it's shorter. It's for like several months instead of, a couple of years. So the commitment is shorter. It actually preceded the Peace Corps. I think part of the story goes that the Peace Corps modeled itself or was inspired in part by this organization, Operation Crossroads Africa. And so they happened to have a program in Eritrea in 1995. I think it was maybe like the only time they ever did the program there. But for me at the time, of course, I had learned something about Eritrea as well in my African studies classes. But, at the time I was sort of like, well, it's close enough, Eritrea, Ethiopia, more or less the same thing, I'll go. And so I joined this program and I spent, the summer of 1995 in Eritrea. I was actually stationed in a small village outside of Asmara called Façade. And I was with 5 or 6 other American volunteers. There was a German volunteer group there. And they matched us with the National Union of Eritrean Youth and Students who were participating in or helping to, direct and manage one of the first summer student reconstruction campaigns, the Karamtawi Ma'atot, in Façade. So it was this collection of Americans, a sort of eclectic group of American students, German students, and then, a large number of Eritrean young people who were brought from different regions and all came to Façade there for the summer to work in the Karamtawi Ma'atot. And in particular, what we were doing was terracing, doing anti-erosion terracing on the mountainsides and planting trees. And in the afternoons, we would do like English language classes or German language classes with the Eritrean students. And it was a wonderful opportunity. I mean, some of the most important relationships that I've had in my life, friendships that I've had in my life with Eritreans started in that summer. I've maintained a couple of those friendships over all these years since 1995. But the more important thing was that it was an incredibly inspiring experience for me. I learned very, very quickly that Eritrea and Ethiopia are not more or less the same thing, right? Like everything was about, I mean, the struggle had just literally ended a couple of years before that. And the, you know, the toll of that struggle in terms of what it had done to people's bodies, to their lives, to the environment, to the economy, like it was evident, it was etched into the landscape and people. But there was this incredible hopefulness too, right? Because independence had just happened. So there was, it was almost like a euphoric period for people that like, it seemed like the future could hold anything, right? There were so many possibilities. And I was so inspired by, you know, most of these young people were, you know, close to my own age, a little bit younger. But they were so committed. They were so, they in many ways knew so much more about the world than I did. And they were, you know, of course, everything, they wanted to tell me everything about Eritrea. They wanted me to learn as much as possible. And I wanted to learn that. So most of my time was really just spent hanging out with them and learning about Eritrean history and Eritrean experience through their eyes and their hopes and their dreams for what might become of the country in the future now that it was independent, for what they might do in their lives, for how they could contribute. Their work ethic was immense. So it was an incredibly inspiring experience for me. And, you know, I was, you know, thinking about going on for graduate studies in anthropology, and that kind of cinched the deal for me because there was also that exciting moment that, you know, very little had really been done by anthropologists in the country or really any scholars in the country because of the war. So, I mean, you know, there was not a lot of literature out there. It seemed like a really wonderful opportunity for me too, and for other people who wanted to do scholarship in the region, that there was a lot that we could contribute, right? Because not that much had been done. So it really influenced my decision to go on to graduate school. I went to Michigan State University for my master's and PhD, in part because it was one of the only, actually the only graduate program in the country where I could study Tigrinya. I really wanted to learn Tigrinya. And so I went to Michigan State. I started there in 1997. And my entire focus was really on the Horn of Africa and especially on Eritrea. So there's a lot more I could say about it, but that's kind of the origin story of how I initially got involved.
Well, one of the research focuses that you have when studying Eritrea, but more generally Horn of Africa nations and their development, is the concept of transnationalism. As part of your research specifically focuses on this topic, could you explain what that is exactly and how you apply this to Eritrea?
Yeah, sure. So I should probably back up a little bit and say that I initially, my intention when I was planning my graduate study, my doctoral dissertation, and what my project would be, I was planning on doing that project completely within Eritrea. I was really interested in the question of gender, ethnicity, and religion in the post-revolutionary period because of the way that these had been, you know, ostensibly rendered less meaningful during the course of the struggle and the development of a common nationalist identity, right? So I was really interested in what that experience was from the internal diversity of Eritrean society relative to the kind of nationalist unity that had been forged and was projected. So that was my initial intention, was to do my, you know, a lengthy period of field work in residence in the country and study those issues. I went back in 1998 to do a language intensive, and the border war started. So my agenda was cut short that summer. I wasn't able to stay there. I was evacuated with other foreigners at the time due to the border war. And because of the war, it forced me to rethink what a feasible dissertation project would look like, because I had to recognize the fact that it might not be possible for a variety of reasons, whether it had to do with access and permission, or whether it had to do with like, safety, or, my university might not let me go if there was a war, active armed conflict happening. So I started to think much more about what kind of a project I could do that would accommodate the reality in the Horn of Africa, recognizing that I may not be able to get to Eritrea for like a long period of time, the way I had wanted to. So I started to reconceptualize my project as a kind of historical and cultural analysis of the relationship between multiple what we would call like vintages or cohorts of people leaving the region, migrating from the region as refugees, or for other reasons, like as students in the 1970s or something like that. I wanted to tell the story of the Eritrean Revolution through the lens of migration and the perspective of refugee communities in particular, in the United States, because that was what was possible for me, right? Like I could work with Eritrean people in the US, and then for periods of time, I could go back. So I adopted a kind of transnational perspective approach to the kind of work that I wanted to do. There had been a few things written, particularly about the refugees movements in the 1980s and people going to Sudan and places like that. But there really wasn't a lot written on Eritrean refugee issues at the time that I started the work. So again, it felt like a way that I could make a contribution. And because the Eritreans that I knew in the diaspora were so incredibly engaged politically and economically, during the border war, of course, many communities raised lots of funds to support, what was happening in Eritrea, to defend the sovereignty of the country as they perceived it, to support their families. So I was aware of these economic and these political linkages. And so the transnational frame was also kind of new in social science. And it was replacing older models of thinking about immigration as kind of a one-way process where people move from country X to country Y and they assimilate, they acculturate, they become American, right? There was a lot of interest in like assimilation and integration. And I was much more interested in the way that people stayed connected to back home. And the ways that they did that, whether they were informal relationships through kinship exchanges and remittances, or whether they were more formalized political relationships. I was aware that Eritreans in the US were organized. They were members of the EPLF. They were members of the PFDJ. They had other kinds of political identities, as I discovered. People remained committed to a kind of ELF identity as well, a kind of oppositional identity. There were churches, Eritrean churches of different varieties, Orthodox, Catholic, Pentecostal. There were Islamic communities. There were different ethnic enclaves, regional enclaves. So I wanted to really think about what this meant for Eritrea in the post-independence period and chart that development as it had happened over decades, right? So I took a kind of historical approach as well. So the transnational paradigm, really what it does is look at these cross-border linkages. It kind of explodes the assumption that immigrants or migrants sever their ties to back home, which we know now historically kind of didn't really happen. It was fairly specific in the American context to white immigrants who were able to, kind of assimilate into the dominant mainstream racial landscape of the US. Harder for those who came from, the global South and from former colonial countries. So transnationalism helps us to understand what these cross-border linkages look like. And gives us a kind of methodological approach to think about how do we identify exactly what those linkages are, what the flows are, the social flows, the financial flows, the political relationships. So if you sort of think about, I came to think about Eritrea as like a global web, rather than like just the country in the Horn of Africa and then its dispersed, diaspora communities. I began to think of it much more in terms of a web where people relate not only to Eritrea from their different diaspora locations, but to one another as well around the globe, right? Because oftentimes families are separated across different countries, but they maintain their linkages as well. So that's in a nutshell kind of the transnational approach and kind of pragmatically why I chose to do that in my research. And it ended up being an incredibly fascinating and complex story and project. And I wrote about it. My first book, called Soldiers, Martyrs, Traitors, and Exiles, is essentially that dissertation project. one of the really surprising things that I found, I think I started out with this assumption that Eritreans in the diaspora had quite a bit of political and economic power in Eritrea, that their diaspora locations made them particularly significant and that they would have an influence on the Eritrean government, right, or on the state. What I discovered was actually that it was kind of the other way around, that the state, the Eritrean state, which is kind of collapsed into the party, there's not much of a distinction between the state as an entity and the government, the party that controls that state. I mean, typically we think of states as, you know, they endure despite changing of governments, right? In the Eritrean case, since independence, we haven't seen that. We've seen a collapse of the party and the state into a single entity, right? And what was so surprising to me was the way that the Eritrean government was really, in terms of the balance of power, was really much more powerful over the diaspora communities than the other way around, right? That even diaspora people who had been loyal, you know, to EPLF or PFDJ, who contributed a lot financially, who were politically engaged, they did not necessarily have the kind of political power that one might expect, or that I for whatever reason, sort of assumed would be the case. In fact, it was kind of the other way around, that the government itself was able to exert a kind of economic and political control across long distances in very intimate ways in people's lives. Not just in terms of like what you might expect, like, you know, expectations for fundraising, or of course the 2% tax that everybody talks about, or, you know, these sort of formalized mechanisms. There were also really informal kinds of ways that the state was present in people's lives in like really intimate ways. So for example, if somebody lost a family member, died or something like that, and they needed to return the body for burial, or they wanted to dispense with that person's, you know, land or something like that, that there were all kinds of ways in which they had to conform to state expectations before they were able to do that kind of intimate work, even within the context of like a kin group, right? So what I discovered was that the state was really a powerful presence, and that led me to really think about this concept of transnational governance, right? That the state governs not just from the territory of what I came to call Eritrea proper, what we see on the map and know as Eritrea, but it embodies itself in a variety of other forms that become very present in people's lives in the diaspora in organized and unorganized ways. So it's a way of thinking about governance as deterritorialized. Really, I mean, you know, it doesn't require the territory in order for the government to function as an administrative unit over a globally dispersed network of people.
Well, how do ruling parties utilize its political power onto the population to consolidate and centralize authority? You talk about how the government essentially is the gatekeeper for any mobilization of the Eritrean population with respect to its dealings inside and outside the country. Does the government recognize its authority, and how does it facilitate its its policy essentially to the rest of the population?
Yeah, so I think what you're asking about is like the mechanism, like how does this happen? The mechanisms, really plural, how does this happen, and where does it come from? And incidentally, I'll say that there was just an op-ed yesterday or the day before in the New York Times actually about long distance authoritarian, like transnational authoritarianism. And it's funny to me because it's like, you know, social scientists have in many ways been thinking about this and writing about this for the better part of 20 years. And, you know, now there's just sort of attention to the fact that, you know, governments around the world can exert this kind of authoritarian relationship vis-a-vis their populations across long distances, right? So Eritrea was not discussed in this particular piece in the New York Times. It was, you know, countries like China and Saudi Arabia and Russia, and, you know, there were a number of different countries that they specifically looked at and focused on. But Eritrea certainly could fit that model as well. And it's not a recent development. I mean, it really, and that's part of what made Eritrea so interesting, is that I think it's been a feature of how, and this was an argument that I made in my book, my dissertation in my book, that it was actually these transnational linkages and relationships that were essential to to being successful in the independence struggle. So the linkages actually begin to be forged in the Eritrean context as early as there are refugees. And we can look back to, earlier strands of migrants already beginning in the 1950s. We can think about like major political figures who were exiled for periods of time, people like Wilda Abdul Mariam or like Ibrahim Sultan, students who were studying in Egypt or, in Sudan, already becoming the basis of the pro-independence nationalist movement and using their base in exile as a mode of, escaping kind of repression, right? Vis-a-vis the Ethiopian occupying regime at the time, to really begin to forge the basis of the independence movement. So that already began as a kind of project, a transnational project. It was regional between the Middle East and North Africa and, and Ethiopia, in fact, as well. I mean, some of the early Eritrean nationalist figures were also part of the pre-revolutionary movements in the 1970s, the early 1970s in Ethiopia, prior to Mengistu, hijacking the whole thing. So we could chart these developments of these transnational relationships from quite early on. In the U.S. context, we had people coming, Eritreans coming in the 1970s as students. They were being sent under Haile Selassie's regime, actually prior to the Ethiopian revolution, so very early, to study, to get university degrees and things like that, under this idea that they would return to Ethiopia and participate in the development of the society. They became Eritrean nationalists and ended up in exile, right? Some of them ended up going back and joining ELF or EPLF and becoming fighters. So these transnational linkages started to form that way as well. Pretty soon, the liberation, the armed liberation forces, and I would say EPLF excelled at this in a way that ELF did not quite develop in such a firm way, a recognition that there would be an immense amount of political and financial support that could be garnered by engaging people who had migrated to Europe or to North America, right? I mean, there were Middle East connections or Gulf state connections as well, but for the EPLF, it was really oriented towards Europe and North America. And so galvanizing the university students, who were, of course, also being radicalized in the context of whatever was happening in the European countries or the US, right? I have a lot of data from interviews of some of these early activists who became Eritrean nationalists in the 1970s and how they were inspired by, the legacy of the civil rights movement, or like African-American struggles, Black liberation struggles, Palestinian liberation struggles, right? There was a kind of global international connection that was informing this early nationalism. So there was an effort among those people to reach back to Eritrea, to make contact with the EPLF and to say, we want to participate in the revolution, even if it's at a distance. And then EPLF started to develop institutional mechanisms to kind of regulate that, right? So chapters of EPLF. Later, it became chapters of the mass organizations. And to really belong and participate, you had to do it in terms of what the EPLF defined as the proper approach. So this was aligned with the kind of, democratic centralist orientation of the EPLF. And there were formalized channels for exchanges of finances, for, political communiques, things like that. But it wasn't always, there was also a lot of efforts at autonomy and independent thinking among some of these early diaspora activists as well. There were student movements. The Eritreans for Liberation in North America was an early organization that was created to support the independence movement. They really thought of themselves as kind of like intellectual leaders, and they wanted to exert a kind of parity with the EPLF leadership in the field. And quickly discovered that that was not really going to be possible, that they would either submit to the party line, or they would be exiled within exile, right? So there was a lot of kind of fragmentation. There was a kind of repression of autonomy, a repression of independent critical thinking. And through these formal mechanisms, the EPLF really developing this kind of consolidating a particular kind of nationalist line that people had to follow, and particular kinds of practices that they had to engage in if they were to be considered members of the front, or, you know, true sympathizers. And if you did not do this, you were, you know, you could suffer, you know, social ostracism and death. I mean, you know, character assassination, actual assassination. I mean, these things were all possibilities, right? So it, you know, the cost of not being in line with the EPLF was very high for people, especially in a small community like Eritreans in a place like North America. So this formalized over time, and after, you know, the mass organizations were formed and consolidated. Then later it became the PFDJ party chapters, which became, you know, formalized in the diaspora, and were the sort of the nerve center of this transnational governance, which we now see. I mean, those party chapters are still there. And now we have, of course, embassies as well, and consulates that become part of this as well after independence. So the mechanisms, I mean, there's a few that remained kind of independent and more autonomous. And some of those are like religious institutions. Churches have tended to be a little bit more independent. You know, and of course, then we see also splits there as well. I mean, splits in the Orthodox Church in North America between those who, you know, remain loyal to Abuna Antonios, who was, you know, placed under house arrest in the early 2000s, and those that are in lockstep with the kind of the party ordained church, right, in Eritrea. So in addition to this notion of transnational governance, I also started to think about what we might call transnational civil society, which, in kind of broadly speaking, political democratic theory, civil society is that sphere of autonomous activity, people joining voluntary associations, that they put a check on, you know, the power of the government or the power of the state. And so I started to think about that civil society for Eritrea actually increasingly exists only in the diaspora, right? There are realms of autonomy, spheres of autonomy, people organizing independently, pushing back against the party of the state. That was always there historically, but it's grown since then. And as we see less and less of that in Eritrea over time, we see more and more of it in the diaspora, right? So we have transnational governance moving from Eritrea across through this web of relationships. But then we also have all of these efforts by Eritreans to organize independently, oftentimes of the state, sometimes in active opposition to the state, and to engage through the same kind of transnational web or network to exert, you know, resistance, I guess you could say, against the domination of the Eritrean state by the PFDJ, the EPLF to the PFDJ. So that was a lot. I hope that makes sense.
It did, but there is one aspect of your explanation that is very important to note, and it's always confused me personally as an Eritrean. How was the EPLF able to completely dominate the political and social scene of the country? Of course, the Eritrean state is not large by population or by physical area, but the high level of centralization and organization kind of reflects a willingness by those in power in the EPLF structure to recognize that they really needed to dominate the situation in the country. How were they able to do that?
I mean, a sort of classic answer would be, well, I would say two things at the outset. One is that they haven't completely been able to dominate, right? And that's part of the problem. Part of the problem from maybe that centralist perspective, because there's always been, I mean, even in the most hegemonic of circumstances, even under conditions of extreme repression, not everyone agrees. Not everyone buys into it. People find modes of resistance, even if they are very, what James Scott, the famous political scientist, social scientist, called weapons of the weak. I mean, even people under conditions of abject slavery find ways to resist. It may not look like the typical political resistance, but it can be embodied in different ways. And so we might look at, migration. Why are so many people fleeing from Eritrea, right? Like, that is a form of political resistance. Even if people don't connect that to a conscious political act, it can be seen as, evidence that the domination is not entirely complete, right? So there's that. The other thing is that there's always a balance of coercion and consent, right? So lots of people buy into ideology. They buy into nationalist ideology. That's not just the case for Eritrea. We can see it happening here in the United States as well. People buy into ideologies because it gives them a sense of meaning, belonging, especially when you have something associated with like massive sacrifice. Lots of people have lost their lives. Society has been disrupted. People need, they want a narrative that explains to them why this makes sense, why this is worth it. Right. And so the really powerful narrative of Eritrean, I mean, and some of the stuff is real. It's not just a narrative, like immense pride, right? Immense pride in one's identity, courage, being able to fiercely defend what you believe in, right? Those are all properties of Eritrean nationalism, and they give people strength and meaning, and they give them identity. So people want to belong to that. So that's the kind of consent part. People go along with it because it's compelling and it gives them a sense of meaning in the world. Then there's the coercion part, which is that if you don't go along with it, you pay a price. And that price can look like different things. It can be, social isolation, or it can mean death. And the entire gamut has been used, obviously, to create a kind of, if not full-on consent, then at least conformity. So I think conformity is the other part. A lot of people conform, not because they necessarily agree with it or think that it's right, but because it's a mode of survival, right? People are just trying to survive. And we don't have to fault them for that. I mean, that's a human impulse. You want to survive. So you go along with all kinds of things that in your conscious mind, you actually harbor resistance, right? And so we see this come out quite a bit in narratives of people who have left Eritrea and sought asylum elsewhere, and they're forced to kind of put their story into that, framework that's going to make sense for an asylum claim. And so even if they've never really thought about what that political opinion was that led them to leave the country, they end up figuring it out in the process, right? And become more conscious. Some of those people go on to become activists, right? Some people already have that critical consciousness before they ever leave the country. So I would say, yeah, so that's what I would say is that, the domination is not complete, never has been. And it functions through a combination of fear, consent, and coercion, and conformity, right? Those are all features of it.
Well, maybe to explain one of the reasons why conformity takes place is the concept of spying and espionage within the structure of the PFDJ as we know today. Many of the local embassies that exist around the world are used by the state to essentially govern Eritreans who live outside the country, which could probably feed into the concept of transnationalism. How does this influence the body politic of Eritreans?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And that element of espionage, for lack of a better term, I mean, again, has been there since the very beginning. Even when the student movement in the 1970s was holding meetings, there were people who were sent specifically to check out what was going on in that meeting and report back, right? So you could go to, I mean, throughout the years that I have been doing my research, you could go to virtually any, opposition meeting, and you would find people attending who other people suspected or knew were, spies for PFDJ or through, and the embassies are one mechanism for this to happen as well. And it's also dispersed throughout communities, right? So you don't necessarily know, and this is the case in Eritrea too, you don't necessarily know who might inform on you, right? So the impact of that is profound. It leads to mistrust. And it's a deliberate tactic that's used often in authoritarian contexts to destroy the basis of solidarity among people who might otherwise organize and become a threat to the powers that be. So if you can keep people divided, I mean, it's not rocket science, right? It's the divide and conquer strategy. If you can keep people mistrusting one another, if you can keep them fearful, then you can better control them. So the division, the division is both a consequence of these kinds of strategies, but it also becomes a self-reinforcing dynamic as well, that once you've achieved that level of mistrust and fear, it can it sort of reinforces itself. Yeah. So I think that we see that Eritrea is, of course, not the only society where this happens, but it's quite pronounced, and it does make it much more difficult to imagine what a future looks like, where that, how do we get over that division and mistrust? I mean, we've reached a moment like that now in American society as well. And I mean, there's a kind of polarization and division throughout American society that leave many of us really wondering, how do we get out of this? How do we transcend it? That's a very difficult set of questions, and I don't have good answers for them.
Well, until that time, there is another question with respect to the society at large that I want to ask. There is obviously a clear link between the militarization of Eritrean society and the growth of the refugee population. Of course, over time, the government has instituted a practice that has restricted the movement of people and denied their basic freedoms and human rights. Is that a direct result of the nature of the leadership's experience in the war, or is there any other political ideology that is driving them to do these things?
Yeah, I'll speak to the broad issue, and hopefully maybe I can address the core of the question of what you're trying to get at. I mean, militarization, I would say, again, not unique to Eritrea, right? Militarization, I mean, the US is a highly militarized society as well. And when we think about militarization, what are we talking about? We're talking about the reorganization of society and economy to serve military purposes, right? And it's accompanied with a kind of ideological dimension, militarism, which is a kind of, you know, a buying into a belief in the necessity of being perpetually mobilized and armed and prepared for war, and a kind of glorification of the symbols of military. And I mean, certainly we see this with, like, you know, the legendary honoring of martyrs, right? Iconic images of the fighters as heroes, soldiers as heroes. They're super citizens, right? So militarization and militarism have been an important strategy in Eritrea for a number of different things. I mean, one, most obviously in terms of defense, also in terms of development. I mean, we see the militarization is linked to national service, which provides a way of you know, supplying low-cost labor for all kinds of purposes within Eritrea. It's a mode through which the Eritrean, you know, narrative of self-reliance can be embodied, that this is a way of preventing, you know, we're both defending the country and we're developing the country, but not just defending the country militarily from, you know, threats, say, coming from Ethiopia or whatever, but also from the imperial interventions of, you know, the global north, attempting to reorganize society and economy through, you know, development lending and things like that. So by directing able-bodied young men and women towards all kinds of tasks, it's a way of repelling these kinds of development interventions coming from abroad. It's also a mode of control, clearly. There's no doubt about that. Military control operates according to a very strict hierarchy, right? There's not a lot of room for dissent. It can be punished harshly under the guise of, or as a justified in terms of military discipline, right? Zero tolerance in the military for forms of dissent or rebellion. It's also a way of maintaining the practice of, you know, kind of political education, re-education. It's a form of indoctrination. And again, not unique to Eritrean militaries. All militaries, when you join the military anywhere, you go through a kind of tearing down of your former self and a rebuilding into the, you know, into the new soldier mentality, right? That's part of what it means to be militarized, to belong to a military, observing a strict chain of command, right? So critical thinking is not encouraged, you know, all the kinds of things that could lead to a contestation of power and a transition in power. So militarization has been a very conscious strategy. I think it's a way of maintaining what was the core of, you know, the kind of nationalist hero during the revolution, during the EPLF period in particular. It's a way of maintaining that over time post-independence. So it's all of those things at once, right? It's a complicated phenomenon. But the fact of the matter is people suffer within the military enormously because it's indefinite, right? People don't have, their future, they don't have a future outside of that. They know that their entire life is going to be structured and dictated by whatever the particular demands of militarization is. And so it's one of the reasons that we see so many people deserting, leaving the country, or at younger and younger ages before they can even be, inducted into the military, they leave, right? Because they know what their future is going to look like in the military. Did I get to the core of your question in that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, from some of the field work that you've done as an anthropologist, what are some of the short and long-term effects that you've seen, either cultural, psychological, or otherwise, that the practices that you described have had on the Eritrean population since independence? We spoke a little briefly about the difference between the revolution generation and those who subsequently lived through the dictatorship. What are some of the important notes that you have collected over the years from the people who have fled the country? And what do you observe or notice from that?
Yeah. So I would say that, it's both in the context of the research that I've done, which is very intensely personal and ethnographic. I talk to people. I develop relationships with them. Some of the relationships that I have with people, like I mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, have gone, for years and years, for decades. So, and then in other ways, I meet people, it's more ephemeral. I'm able to just kind of observe and talk with them. I don't necessarily have that kind of deep trusting relationship with people, but I know enough about the situation that there's a kind of base of common knowledge that we can meet. They know that I'm not a kind of naive foreigner that they have to explain where Eritrea is on a map, right? Like it's evident that we can have a deeper conversation from the get-go. So part of it is through the actual research process. Part of it is through just my life, right, has been embedded with Eritreans since I first went there. Part of it also is through the work that I've done with asylum applications. I have played a role in helping work with attorneys and with asylum applicants and their families to help them, to help explain to an American judge or asylum officer, like, what is the context here that's happened to this person, so that the adjudicators can make a more fair decision about that case. So I'm privy to the narratives and oftentimes the associated documents, like the psychological evaluations, the medical evaluations that look at the evidence of torture that people have experienced. So I would say there's an immense amount of post-traumatic stress disorder for people. I mean, I'm not a psychologist. I don't mean that in a kind of diagnostic or clinical sense. I mean it in a sort of broad descriptive sense. People have been through immensely traumatic experiences, and it's not all related to just one thing, right? Part of it is maybe what happened to them in the context of military service. A lot of widespread sexual assault of women. And it's something that people don't talk about. There's in many parts of the world, everywhere, sexual assault is associated with shame. You don't, want to reveal these things. People have been treated in very abject ways, tortured in very abject ways. And it's humiliating and it's painful to have to talk about these things. So there's personal trauma, that level of individual trauma. There's also collective trauma, because there's a recognition that, I think for many Eritreans, one thing that's been interesting to me and that I've talked about with lawyers as well, is that people have a hard time talking about their own individual experience. They tend to talk about the collective experience. So that tells us two things. It tells us that the experience that these individuals are having is widely shared, right? It's a pattern, a social pattern. But it also tells us that people, and people oftentimes explicitly say this, like, what happened to me was not that bad because it happens to everyone. So learning to recognize that being raped or being tortured is terrible, should never happen to anyone. It was a massive abuse of somebody's bodily integrity, their dignity, their human rights. People have to actually learn to think in those terms, because they've been so systematically prevented and punished harshly for thinking in those terms, for even imagining that they might think in those terms, that it becomes a mode of consciousness raising as well for people. So I think that, we see a lot of trauma, individual trauma, collective trauma. Luckily, there are a number of amazingly capable Eritrean psychologists who have experience in this area, sometimes through their own personal experience or have experience like cultural experience, and are able to adapt cultural models of therapy that work for Eritrean people, because there is a kind of stigma associated with talking about what's happened to you and trauma and abuse. There's a stigma against getting psychological support because you're seen as, there isn't a tradition of that, right? So people don't think of it as like they need help, right? It would be shameful to have to get that help. So having Eritrean clinical psychologists at the forefront and social workers at the forefront of saying, like, we recognize what these patterns of trauma are and what they mean for people, where they come from, and we can develop, ways of therapies and support approaches for people that are, that work for them linguistically, culturally, in terms of like the background knowledge. Because if you think about it, like you're an Eritrean person who's come through these terrible experiences, and now you have to go into a room with some random American shrink and explain it to them. Like, how can they possibly explain what that, that would be almost more traumatic to have to do that, right? So being able to talk to someone in your own language who already shares that entire background of information is, I think, incredibly important. And so we're just really beginning to see that blossoming and developing in the diaspora. But that kind of trauma, that sort of impact, it makes it very hard for people to want to be engaged politically, right? Like, I think there's an assumption among some older generations of people who came as refugees, particularly like from the opposition camp, that as soon as these young Eritrean refugees started showing up, who had been in the military and had experienced the repression firsthand, that they would automatically become politically active, right? And that they would be the new generation of opposition activists. And I think there was a vast underestimation of the level of trauma that people were coming with, and the way in which they were still beholden and fearful about speaking out because of the consequences on family members back home, right? And so sometimes we would see examples where, like, a young person would come and apply for asylum, and then somebody would see them going to the PFDJ sponsored party, and they would go, "Oh, they're a fake asylum seeker." That's a misunderstanding of the intensity of the trauma and of the demand for political conformity, right? Yeah, I'm going to show up at that government party if it means my mom's not going to get arrested, right? Like, if that's the cost. So, I think there are some interesting dynamics going on with like what we can expect for people's political consciousness related to their experience, and that these things are more complicated than we recognize, in part because of this massive trauma factor, as I would call it.
Well, to transition to another topic, which may be more hopeful for the future of Eritrea, previous generations have used anti-militarism and nonviolent change, which draws from the civil rights tradition of world leaders throughout history, to facilitate the message of reform in the country. For instance, the protests at the University of Asmara against the military education led to mass detainments of students. What is the overall significance of this type of resistance, and what are the variations of it? Are there feminist engagements in this type of work, and what role do some of these people play?
Yeah, I love that question. And this is such a fascinating topic for me. I'm very interested in militarism, but I'm even more interested in anti-militarism as a phenomenon. I think we have to be careful at the outset to recognize that that anti-militarism can mean a variety of things. Fundamentally, it's a principled position, right? One is opposed to militarism and militarization and all the entailments that go with that, including, killing and harming other people, as a principled position, right? That can be a principled position. And so we have people who become conscientious objectors. They will not serve in the military because it is against their conscience, right, to do so. That's the principled position. And that's probably the minority of people who fall into what we might call an anti-militarist position. That takes a particular kind of level of commitment to a principle that many people may not arrive at, and I don't fault them for that. But it's another level of that kind of ethic. I think what we see more of are people who oppose what militarization does. They may not say that, like if they could serve in the military for a period of time, right, and be released, be demobilized, and it was like any other military service that was like temporary, or could become a career if that's what they chose, to have a career in the military. We're not accompanied with like repression and abuse and all these other kinds of things. Probably many people would be like okay with that, right? Like, it's not, military service is not inherently like a terrible thing. It doesn't have to be. But there are people who resist the current manifestation of what that looks like in a place like Eritrea, right? And so they're sort of not necessarily principled anti-militarists, that they oppose militarization and military service and war and all of that as a principle. They're opposed to the particular form that they currently have in Eritrea. So they would like to see a kind of reform of that. And in resisting it, and deserting the military, coming out against the military, the student movement that you noted, we can't assume that all those people actually have that principled anti-militarist position. They may just be opposing, like, they don't want to have to go, they want to go study in university. They don't want to have to do their military service. And so they join a kind of anti-militarist moment, but it's not, again, a kind of principled position that they would maintain, beyond that strategic moment. So I think that's one thing I'd say. There are principled anti-militarists among Eritreans. There are relatively few, but I think that's significant. There was a group in Germany. I'm not sure that they're active right now, but they were in the earlier, like around 2008, 2009, that period, the Eritrean Anti-Militarist Initiative in Germany, based in Germany. And they were very principled anti-militarists, and they had linkages with War Resisters International, which is one of the main, kind of global anti-militarist initiatives. There are people who have become active with, like, in anti-landmine activities. And that is coming from a principled place of anti-militarism. Conscientious objectors, right? There are those as well. I think it's really interesting that people can arrive at that position, especially in the context of a society like Eritrea, where to be an anti-militarist, to be a principled anti-militarist, really puts you on the fringe, right? You are really a minority, and you are really going to be, because the Eritrean national identity is so embedded with a kind of militarist ethic, right? To oppose that in a principled way is extraordinarily brave. It's incredibly courageous. There's this image of people who oppose the military, the anti-militarists, as like, weak, fearful cowards who just don't want to, sacrifice, or they're afraid of battle or something like that. I actually see it the other way around. I think that anti-militarists are some of the most courageous people, right? Because they're standing up against something, the power of which is so incredible in terms of, like, indoctrination, ideology, coercion, punishment. Like, they're standing up against all of that and saying, this is morally wrong, and I will not participate in it. That's an incredibly brave thing to do. So as a phenomenon, I think anti-militarism is really interesting. And we can see that it's not, there are other people who more broadly belong to a kind of nonviolent resistant tradition. And that's probably more present. That goes beyond just the sort of narrow, more narrow group of people who would really subscribe to a firm principled anti-militarism. So people who believe in nonviolent change. The guys who and the women who have been involved in the Eritrean movement for democratic and human rights. The translation of Gene Sharp's book on nonviolent resistance into Tigrinya, was a really significant moment, I think. There was a document that was crafted by I think it was the Eritrean Youth Global Movement. It's very hard to find now, but at the time it was called New Birth of Freedom, Hadish Harnat. And it was a really profound critique of militarization and the advancing of a kind of nonviolent blueprint for transformation, right? What would an Eritrean society look like that had advanced this kind of nonviolent transformation? Not military overthrow, but like a peaceful, nonviolent transition. What would that look like? Again, minor currents in the Eritrean movement, but I think really, really important, because they move us beyond that model that everything happens through the barrel of a gun or it doesn't happen at all, right? Like the only hope for transformation is a military overthrow. You can overthrow a government militarily, but if you don't have a cultural and political and a moral kind of ethic that can sustain what comes after that, you're more likely to end up just continuing to perpetuate different cycles of conflict. You need more cultural resources than that to say, what is a society going to look like where war and militarization is not the default position? That's very hard to do, especially in a context like Eritrea. So I admire those people immensely.
Well, what role do opposition organizations play in being an alternative to the PFDJ and their organizations? One that I am thinking of when I ask this question is the National Union of Eritrean Women, which is run by the party, versus some of the opposition groups, which are led by women, including the Network of Eritrean Women. How do those opposition civil institutions try to not only oppose them, but make a message saying that they are the valid or the reasonable alternative that Eritreans should follow?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough question. And there's a variety of different, what we might broadly describe as opposition groups, right? You have political parties that, are identifiably political parties. Then you have, associations of people that are more voluntary. They're more like civil society, right? Like I was talking about before. And all of them have an important role to play. There is a tendency, I think, and I've observed this over a long period of time, a kind of pattern within a lot of Eritrean diaspora organizing, to want to control the fragmentation and constantly bring people into coalesce people into larger coordinated organizations. I understand the logic of that. It makes sense. Things have to be coordinated. Of course, that makes sense. And you need both. You need a whole array if you really want to have a democratic society. And I don't mean a formal democracy, like representative, what we have in the US. I'm talking about a more radical version, like social democracy, right? If you really want to have that, you need all of these features. You need the political parties. You need the civil society organizations. You need people to feel like they have a role to play in whatever that might look like. You need religious bodies. A lot of people participate in all kinds of social development activities through the channel of churches, right? Or other religious organizations. So all of these players matter, right? And there needs to be room for all of them. The thrust towards a constant discourse of unity, I think, can become problematic because it implies, again, a sort of reiteration of conformity, that we all have to agree fundamentally, and we all have to have the same, goal. I mean, you can have the same goal, but you can have different ways of getting there, right? And you can define that goal a little bit differently. But if you support one another in a set of common objectives, there's more room for diversity in how you get to whatever that final shared goal would be, which I'm assuming is a more peaceful and just and freer society, right? Women play a huge role. I mean, an absolutely huge role. And they always have, when they have not been prevented from doing so by the kind of reiteration of patriarchy, which is a constant problem, right? Many nationalist movements, and Eritrea I would include in this, utilize a kind of gender liberation dynamic, but subsume it underneath a national liberation dynamic, so that gender liberation in and of itself, women's emancipation is not a principle unto itself that people care about. It's what that can do to serve the larger goal of the nation. And so in that case, there will always be a kind of, 2 steps forward, 1 step forward, 2 steps back kind of thing. Patriarchy will always exert the drag back on women, right? To put them back in the box after they've been, useful for whatever the agenda was. But one of the things that I think really stands out in the Eritrean landscape today, transnational landscape, is the development of, or the emergence, and it's not super recent. I mean, this has been going on for quite some time, of really powerful women who are leading out on all manner of different kinds of projects, from journalism and research to humanitarian work, to political leadership, to some of the most significant voices arguing for reconciliation between, not just within Eritrea, but trying to build bridges and dialogue with Ethiopians, Tigrayans, have been Eritrean women. And this is, I don't want to, I'm certainly not going to fall into like gender stereotypes and say women are better peacemakers because they, are inherently more linked to kind of the nurturing of life and all of that. But I think there is a grain of truth in that. Like women are, part of how we survive as a species is by not killing each other, by preventing conflict. And women have played that role in many societies and many periods of history. And I think Eritrean women are playing that role right now and have been for quite some time. Second generation women too, second and third generation Eritrean women who have been born and raised in the diaspora are also becoming really powerful leaders. And I think that's really important because the younger the generations of people who were born in places like the US or Europe or whatever, Eritreans, they're culturally different than their parents and grandparents, right? They're not the same. I mean, they're all Eritrean, but there's a ton of diversity within what we mean when we say Eritrea, right? So, and if we include the entire network, that global web that I talked about, we're talking about a lot of diversity, cultural diversity and generational differences. So I think seeing these leaders emerge and interface with, but also kind of push back on the older generations and say, that's not the way we can do things now moving forward. We have to do it differently. And women are not going to be shunted over here in this box and just, cooking for the cultural parties or whatever, and organizing fashion shows. They're going to be like out front, like leading and challenging the men to do better. And I see a lot of Eritrean women doing this, and I cannot even tell you how much respect and admiration I have for them.
An underrated aspect of national change is the recognition of certain moments in history which caused an important change in the conversation about many issues. A lot of people would cite the tragedy of Eritreans sinking off the coast of Lampedusa in October 2013 as an example of this, where the ruling party was shown to have never truly conceded to reality of the refugee crisis, which caused many Eritreans to doubt the legitimacy of the leadership. What examples in Eritrean history do you think are important for Eritreans to remember?
Examples of, maybe you can rephrase that for me a little bit.
Sure. What are some of the most poignant examples or turning points in Eritrean history that you think are important for us to remember? I'll also include the upcoming 20th anniversary of the lockdown of the G15.
Yeah, there's all number of, major kind of moments and flashpoints I think that we can point to. Certainly, I mean, the border war, massive turning point, right? That changed the trajectory of what happened in the first decade of Eritrea's independence. I mean, it completely changed the tracks, one could say. Yes, I mean, I think the arrest of the G15, the shutting down of the newspapers, the arrest of religious leaders who were not, approved by the government. I mean, these were also flashpoints for sure. Yeah, a moment like the Lampedusa crisis. I mean, that has received an enormous amount of attention because it was, such a large number of people. It's at one time, but that number of people are perishing all the time in the matrix of, the migration crisis, which is not a global North crisis. It is a global South crisis. And, the global North is adding to the problem more than anything else by creating all kinds of strategies to prevent people from ever getting, to the global North countries, including through partnerships with governments like Eritrea's to exert containment strategies at the source. And, that I think is, we have to, I mean, it's not just those moments, it's also what led up to them, what enabled those moments to happen in the first place, what came after them that's significant. I mean, these flashpoints can be moments of entry when we have to ask much deeper questions and critical questions. And we have to think beyond that moment of crisis to put it in a context, right? There's a lot of pressure on today on all of us to think in terms of like these emergent momentary like crisis, right? This crisis moment. I mean, we see it even with something like climate change, right? We focus on a crisis like, Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Ida right now in New Orleans. We focus on wildfires and, threatening to consume, huge swaths of California. And we think of these as like, we talk about them as though they're these emergent crises, but like, how did we get there, right? Like there's all kinds of stuff that led us to a situation where that becomes possible. And there's all kinds of things that we can learn from it moving forward if we are willing to ask difficult questions about it. And so I think lots of people have done that with all of these different moments in Eritrea. I mean, if you look at an Eritrean history, recent history, lots of scholarship, lots of journalism, lots of, conversation in Eritrean circles about the meaning of these things. Where did they come from? Why did they happen? How did it go down the way that it did? What do we do next? I mean, that's all there. Yeah, people are working on these issues for sure. But they're always much more complicated than just that flashpoint moment.
I appreciate that you kind of explained that there is a background to some of the crises that have happened. Maybe a transition to where I think the attention really needs to go to is the documentation of all these things that have happened. Eritrean social and political organizations that claim to be opposed to the current system and were created at certain points in time obviously don't last, but the documentation they produce could provide useful information for newer generations of Eritreans to look back into the past and learn from the mistakes of others in order to build a more formidable institutional network of civil society networks, organizations, the litany of all of the different groups that exist in Eritrea. In your opinion, how important is it to study these ethnographic sources that could contribute to the reconstructing of our understanding of Eritrean social and political histories?
I mean, I think it's absolutely essential, right? During the time that I was doing my field work in Eritrea, I spent a lot of time in the Research and Documentation Center in Asmara, which was at the time a wonderful archive. I don't know what the status of it has become today. But it was a wonderful archive. I mean, there was an effort to really preserve documentation during the revolutionary period. And so I was able to read all kinds of original sources in Tigrinya that, talked about, I mean, letters exchanged between student movements, the student movement and like the EPLF leadership. I mean, there was so much of this kind of stuff available. I don't know how available that is now. I mean, insofar as Eritrea is quite difficult to access for researchers. I don't know what the status of that looks like now, but this information exists. I mean, it may not be always written. It's oftentimes in people's memories, and that, brings the question of oral history to the fore and the need to really like interview. I mean, every young Eritrean person should, if they have grandparents and parents, they should be interviewing them and finding out like what their knowledge and experience are, because some of it may not be written down, but it's really important to maintain that record. And you're absolutely right that organizations come and go. But if they leave an archival trace, it allows us to reconstruct things in the past that tell us a great deal about the present. So one of my favorite little pet projects in my dissertation research was to reconstruct the social history of the Eritreans for Liberation in North America, the EPLF, or ENASA is what they were called from their Tigrinya acronym. And it was an absolutely fascinating piece of Eritrean history that most people had not looked at, even though a lot of people lived it. They just didn't think of it as something like this is historically important, right? So I would come along and ask them lots of questions, and I would ask them to, do you have any pamphlets left over? Do you have copies of letters? And I was able to, really create both a written and an oral archive of what this movement was. And it was through that I figured out initially how this original relationship between, the EPLF kind of command and control vis-a-vis organizations in the diaspora that were trying to assert a kind of autonomy or parity or equality with that leadership to participate with them, right? A lot of those patterns could be detected, right? That's where they originated. So then when I went to study like mass organizations and their relationship with EPLF, or later with PFDJ, it made so much more sense because I had a sense of this historical pattern, right? it's been really gratifying to me that a number of Eritrean writers and scholars have picked up on that work and have taken it further. I think the stuff that I published about Afilna was like the only stuff that anybody had bothered to do in terms of scholarship about that period of Eritrean history. And it's been wonderful to see other people pick that up and say, hey, look, this is actually significant. We need to pay attention to it. Same way with other kinds of documentation that are emerging. I mentioned this document, The New Birth of Freedom, that was put out by the Eritrean Youth Global Movement some years ago. And I think it's a fascinating document of, that at one time will be, and I wrote about it in one of my publications, that, it really tells us something significant about what's happening in that moment. And if we connect that to what happened in the past, and then eventually when we look back from the future vantage point at what that meant, lots of things fall into place and the picture becomes clear, because as we're in the moment, of course, it's all just a sort of a swirl, right? We're just living in the moment, and it can be hard to kind of see the patterns. But if you use these sources, oral sources, written sources, patterns emerge over time, and they can tell you something really important about the present and about the future.
In closing, I'd like to discuss some of the correspondence that you've had with Eritreans on the issues that we've discussed. You described in a panel discussion last year with members of the Eritrean American diaspora that the concept of unity as a process in which the desired goal is never technically achieved but perfected over time is not as effective as utilizing the concept of solidarity, which empowers people to understand and empathize with one another's internal struggles and to build a commonality with the rest of the Eritrean population. As reconciliation becomes a growing necessity for the Eritrean population, especially in the context of the war in Tigray, what would you advise viewers who are interested in the well-being of the country to start doing to rebuild the deep-seated division that exists in Eritrean society?
I think I think people are doing it. I think it's happening already. It has been happening for a long time. It's not it's not a clear-cut process. I do worry a lot about a reassertion of the language of unity. We see the language of unity all the time. Of course, unity inherent, it's a positive word, right? We have positive associations with it. Agreement, we're all on the same page. We're going to be, but I also think that it can lead to a kind of a reiteration of conformity, and it demands that everybody sort of conform to a particular position. And when you stray from that, or you move outside of that, it becomes a source of fragmentation and conflict. And that, to me, does not get us beyond the issues that we face as a species, let alone just in terms of like what we could say about the Eritrean situation. I don't think, I think unity becomes an elusive goal, and it becomes a way of trying to control people more than it becomes, something that can actually fulfill itself. So yeah, I definitely prefer the concept of solidarity. I think that it directs us to recognize that despite differences in identity, differences in experience, background, different ideas about how we imagine a just and more free future for everyone. It enables a diversity of perspectives in that way, and to recognize that by finding common ground with one another, despite our differences, that we can get a lot further than if we insist that everybody agrees on the same kind of thing, right? So you can build coalitions, right? Broad coalitions. You may differ on a number of points, but if you have a sort of core set of principles that you're all going to agree on, and you support one another, you have each other's back when you can, right? Amid these differences, without insisting that everybody is the same, I think that it's more promising as a model for social transformation and political transformation. How exactly that happens, I think is again, I think it's through coalition building. I think it's through embracing a kind of real democratic principle in one's behavior and one's orientation. Not just in terms of the formal elements of what we might say democracy. Have you held elections? Do you have, bylaws? Do you, all these kinds of things that people get hung up on, the form of things. it's the substance that really matters. So how are these different organizations providing space for one another to pursue their different agendas, but then where do they come together and what do they agree on and how do they move forward amid this diversity? And with utmost kind of respect for the integrity of each person, each group as having, a valid kind of agenda. So that's really easy to say. It's very difficult, obviously, to do. I mean, if I were to think about that in the American context and somebody were to say to me, you need to go, I'm sure you can find things that you might agree on with, the Proud Boys or, I don't actually, this is a terrible example. I don't think I could find anything that I would agree with in that context. But like, if somebody were to say to me, you think about your most mortal political enemy and then assume that, you have solidarity with them, right? Like find a common ground. That's going to be hard for me to do, right? So I don't expect that I can just say these things and then somehow magically that would work for anyone else, right? That would be ridiculously hypocritical. But I do think that it's a good goal to strive for, to think like that. I would like to see people talk more about solidarity than about unity. And that is present in the Eritrean movement. I mean, the Eritrean Global Solidarity has been an organization that's been present on the diaspora scene for a while. And they do have this kind of, ethic, or they did at the time that I was, particularly following what they were up to. It's been a few years, so I'm not sure where they're at these days. But I mean, that was one of the things that I admired about them as well, is that they had this kind of a notion of solidarity instead of one of unity, that I thought allowed for a more democratic practice and ethic.
Looking back at your experience in working on the Eritrea case and coming to learn about the country through the aspect of political and military repression, what have been some of your reflections or takeaways in the past couple of years of your research career? And do you think it's a tragic story of missed potential and needless violence, or is it one of resilience and inspiration?
I mean, I think it's all of that, right? I mean, I'll be very honest and say that there have been periods of time, and this is my privilege as a person not of Eritrean descent, as an American. There have been periods of time in my life when I've had to step away from Eritrean issues because it has been so profoundly painful. And that's because people that I know and who are dear to me have had their lives. These are not just patterns that I study in the abstract. I mean, these are real humans, right, that I care about, who have gone through these experiences. And it's led me to try to step away from time to time, or to have to step away because of the impact, right? I mean, I've had my own kind of forms of, trauma that I've, vicarious trauma that I've experienced as a result of the kind of work that I've done with Eritreans. So it has been that very tragic, especially, the current war right now. I mean, there have been times when I have not been able to watch the news because emotionally, it wrecks me, right? So yeah, tragic, absolutely. Missed opportunities, no doubt. I mean, I think back to those kids that I met in the summer of 1995 and how incredibly hopeful they were. And, I think about like what became of some of those people. Like, are they dead? Hopefully they're not, and they were able to, make a life for themselves somehow, either within the country or most likely outside of it. That's a tragedy in and of itself, that so many people have had to leave Eritrea, right? We think about the immense intelligence, the skill, the courage, all of these incredible qualities that people have that they could have put to the use of the country, right? And they were prevented from doing that for a whole variety of reasons that to my mind are not necessary, right? So yes, immense tragedy, immense lost opportunity, but there's a lot of resilience as well. I mean, that story is there too. I mean, I was talking earlier about like the immense courage of becoming somebody who's anti-militarist, right? The inspiring leadership of like these young, particularly young women, not just young women, women in general, who are coming to the fore. The fact that somebody like you is doing a program like this. I mean, these are all incredibly hopeful, positive things. So that story is there too. And I think sometimes we tend to focus all the time on the problems, the suffering, the negativity. I mean, any of us who do kind of human rights oriented work, that we think about that stuff a lot, right? But I try to
I try to check that too and look at the other side of things and say, but there are reasons to be really hopeful. Like Eritrea will survive. The country will survive. People will survive. Hopefully, the future will be better. That is definitely my hope. And if I could, in some small, humble way, contribute to that, I would be, my life would have been worth it. So that's what I would say.
Dr. Hepner, I'd like to give you the final word.
Oh, what else can I say? I think that was probably a good spot to end. But I will also say this, that I really appreciate what you're doing, George. I think it's really valuable and important from the first time that you reached out to me, and it took us multiple conversations to get to this point. I really admire you for what you're doing, and I support you in what you're doing. I look forward to seeing what you do in the future, because I think you have a contribution to make.
Thank you, Dr. Hepner, for coming on the platform, and I appreciate taking your time to speak with me.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, George.